My name is Khaliya, and as they said, I am a Columbia University-trained public health specialist, focusing on mental health. But what a lot of people don't know is that, for me, life was not always so easy. Up until about 3 years ago, I sometimes struggled to even get out of bed. I had been the victim of a violent crime and refusing to come to terms with it. I quickly saw it envelop me, slowly but imperceptibly dropping a veil of sadness and fear over everything. From the outside, it wasn't noticeable. I did not speak of what occurred and did a pretty good job, at least in the beginning, of putting on a brave poker face. But I really started to suffer, and the first year especially was where not just my behavior, but my person, me, started to change. On the inside, it was horrible. But on the outside, it actually looked great. Try not eating for a year and you look pretty good. You get all sorts of compliments. But keeping a secret like that changes a person. And it changed me. It was like the best of times and the worst of times. And that is why I'm here to you today, to talk about the very thing that people usually avoid talking about, and that is mental health. And the question I would like to pose today is, what if most of what we knew about mental health was wrong? When I think of mental health, I think about three things that I think are going to change the face of mental health, of public health, actually. Blind spots, neuroplasticity, and psychedelic science. And strange as it sounds, these things are intimately correlated. Let's first start with blind spots. Many years ago, I read a story that stuck with me. It was a book by one of my heroes, Oliver Sacks, and it was a collection of case studies on strange neurological conditions. In particular, one particular story was a woman called Mrs. S, who was in her 60s and suffered a massive stroke, which impacted the functioning of her right cerebral hemisphere. She is, or seemed for the most part, unaffected. She was intelligent, humorous, and 100% still there. But yet, she suffered from a strange condition that would make it so that she could only see things that happened to be on her left field of vision. So, for example, she would complain she wanted more food because the stewards hadn't given her enough. And yet, half of her plate, the left half, of course, was untouched and uneaten. Another, one of my favorite examples, was that if you took her to look at something 60 degrees to your left, she would revolve around her wheelchair 300 degrees, which is why they call it eyes right, because she could only go right. This behavior was unusual, to say the least. But Mrs. S didn't know. She continued on happily, unaware that she was seeing really only 50% of the world. Her mind protected her from what she did not know by pretending to know. This is what I call blind spots. And the truth is that we all, to varying degrees, have these blind spots. And science does too. I would even go as far as to say that some of the blind spots in the medical industry could be more appropriately called blinders, like what they put on racehorses so that they can see only what they're shown and no more. But we'll get back to that later. So getting back to the question, what if most of what we knew about mental health was wrong? What if we are all stuck with working with 50% of the facts and we're told that that was the whole picture? I mean, think about it. Wasn't it only 30 years ago that we were told that dietary fat was bad? In the 1980s, it was like a revelation, and everyone jumped on the bandwagon, doctors and lay people alike. And this idea persisted as issues like heart disease, diabetes, and obesity rose to epidemic levels. And non-communicable diseases rose to be some of the biggest killers worldwide, as they are today. Great ideas can spread, but so too sometimes can bad ideas hang around, and hang around so long that you forget that you have the option of questioning them. Last year, the Journal of the American Medical Association produced a paper in which one of the authors said, and I quote, "Placing limits on fat intake has no basis in science." No basis in science. What else have we believed that, in fact, has no basis in science? With food, they say that we are able to disprove the prevailing theory that fat was bad by accumulating an enormous burden of proof in the form of people that, despite following the appropriate protocols, were in fact getting sicker, dying even. Looking back, at a critical juncture in time, it had been decided that eliminating fat was the answer to our health problem, or at least various lobbyists' fiscal problems, and the road was chosen. But what if they had chosen another road? And what if this kind of wrong turn happened elsewhere in science? A wrong turn that we are only now beginning to understand is a wrong choice because we again see a pattern of disease that makes it impossible to ignore. If we had taken the right choice, humanity would be better off, correct? So it follows that if we are doing everything in line with the theory and everything is getting worse, not better, wouldn't it be safe to say, perhaps, that we had taken the wrong road? Such, as I believe, is the mistake we made with mental health, and a mistake I would like us to take a look at today. So let's take a look at it. What is mental health? In a nutshell, mental health is the absence of mental illness, just as being healthy is the opposite of being sick. But in physical health, there is not just sick and not sick. You can be injured. You can be healing. There aren't really words like that in mental health. So today, I would like to introduce a new term, and that term is mental injury. To explain what mental injury is, I would like you to think of a woman in your life, someone you love, a mother, a daughter, a child. Picture this person. Next, think of somebody that you know is a veteran of war. Maybe you don't know one. Maybe imagine your friend's friend. Picture them in your mind. Now picture this. 1 out of every 3 to 5 women will be the victim of violence or sexual assault in their lifetime. We are talking about more than 1 woman per minute. And in the US alone, 1 out of 4 veterans of war suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome. And every new day, 22 of them commit suicide. Now I ask you, are these people mentally ill? Were they before? Or did they become so? And if they became so, is there a way that we can fix it? I think the answer to that question is yes. By calling mental distress mental illness, we imply that these people are broken, and that it is partially because many of the tools that we are using simply didn't work. But mental injury carries within it, as a term, the seed of hope. A hope that we will finally be able to use tools that do work. So now that we have a working definition, let's see, who else is mentally injured? Well, statistically, mental illness, mental injury, affects 1 in 4 people over the courses of their lives and is projected to account for more than half of the global burden of disease. And these numbers are growing rapidly, particularly among youth. Because mental injury is not just PTSD, it is also depression, anxiety. Most people, when they think of mental health and the tools that the psychiatric industry has made available, think of SSRIs. They think of Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that are often used in these instances. They also think of benzodiazepines, Valium, Ativan, Ambien, Klonopin, used to reduce anxiety and help people sleep. There's also the neuroleptics, Risperdal, Zyprexa, Seroquel. These are the antipsychotics. So you see, there are a lot of things out there, and I think, judging from some of the eyes out there, many of you have heard of these. These avenues all work to change the chemistry of the brain and to make certain substances of the brain more or less available, which produces outcomes along the lines of the desired response. But most of these drugs were developed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and began spreading into more widespread use in the 80s and 90s until now. Along with psychology, these were the tools that we had then and that we still have. But while these drugs all work on changing the levels of neurotransmitters, none of them impact neuroplasticity. And this is key. Now you may ask, what is neuroplasticity? Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize itself to compensate for injury or loss. Brain reorganization takes place by way of axonal sprouting, where undamaged neurons grow new nerve endings to connect with the other undamaged nerve cells, forming new neural pathways to accomplish a needed function. So, for example, Miss S, from Oliver Sacks' book, was able to function despite her injury by rerouting signals around the damaged tissue. And an easy example to yourself of neuroplasticity is to try to brush your teeth with your non-dominant hand for a week. In the beginning, it will be hard, but then suddenly it will get easy. Because neurons that fire together wire together. Or the more you encourage axonal sprouting around an activity, the more your brain will create pathways that make that activity faster and easier. Originally, it was thought that our brains were the most plastic at birth and decreased in neuroplasticity over time. Natural ways to increase neuroplasticity are things like learning an instrument and exercise. But one of the best ways that these pathways are built is through repetition. With age, it was thought that our brains were less plastic. But we are starting to rethink that hypothesis. What if it was not so much that the brain was less plastic, but that as an adult, you had trained your brain so well at certain things that it was hard to fight getting off of the most used pathways. Neural pathways are there as learned patterns to help us get through life more easily, and also to help us with survival. For example, in PTSD, neural pathways are also altered. Your survival mechanism is triggered, and it goes into fight or flight. Bypassing the prefrontal cortex and going straight into the primitive zone of the brain, where the amygdala is. This is the limbic system. And the problem with this is that it's very hard to undo. It is, after all, the mechanism that was put in place to keep you alive, and one of the ones that gets most hardwired the most quickly. Attempts through the years to address this have been largely unsuccessful. Cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, and SSRIs. But these tools are woefully inadequate to their task. What we need in this case, as in the case of more mental injuries, is to harness the power of neuroplasticity and to harness the brain's own power to heal. Psychiatric medications, for the most part, shackle the brain and control the level of neurotransmitters, but don't necessarily create a change in behavior and don't necessarily create a change in the person. Neuroplasticity changes that, which takes me to my third point, psychedelic science. No, psychedelic science is not a misnomer. It is a real science with real tools. In fact, when you look at the path not taken, when we look at the fork in the road that led to the current tragic state of mental health, and it is indeed tragic, I think about the idea that perhaps we have spent the last 50 years solving for only half of the equation, keeping the mentally ill alive, but not healing them. So when I ask the question, what if most of what we understand about mental health is not true? I was also inferring, what if we are not admitting to what we don't know? What if we have been forced to wear blinders, to not see the other half of the mental health equation, the very side where the answers to these cries of suffering may be found? Psychedelics are characterized by generating hallucinations, distortions of perception, altered states of awareness, and some examples of psychedelics are LSD, MDMA, and ayahuasca. Some of these are also known as entheogens, chemical substances typically of plant origin that are ingested to produce a non-ordinary state of consciousness for spiritual or religious purposes. Many of these plants and substances have been used over millennia to help people understand the world and their place in it. Even wine is considered an entheogen because it was used by the Greeks and Egyptians in the worship of Dionysus. What entheogens on the whole really do, particularly in the case of LSD, MDMA, and ayahuasca, is to help create new neural pathways by increasing rapidly and often in sort of challenging ways neuroplasticity to levels commonly seen only in children. When LSD was discovered, for example, so potent were its effects that the CIA immediately started doing large-scale experiments, thinking that they had found a tool for mind control. And the public at large also started doing large-scale DIY experiments with mixed results. Now, just to be clear, I am not promoting the use of psychedelics. I am, however, promoting the use of science. For example, if I told you that there was a drug currently in trials that in severely depressed, treatment-resistant patients healed the patients in 3 to 4 sessions with a 72% success rate, you would say that's crazy. That can't possibly be true. But it is true. And this is just one of the psychedelic drugs that is currently in trials, and it is one of the many that show real promise, specifically in treating depression and PTSD, but for a number of other things involving the element of neuroplasticity. These other trials have been taking place all in the last few years. That's why you haven't heard of it, when the ban, which has been 50 years now, on psychedelics was lifted for certain specific research streams. Major institutions such as Johns Hopkins, NYU, and Imperial College London have persisted in the face of huge obstacles to progress this science. And groups such as the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, the Berkeley Foundation, and the Hefner Institute are, in my opinion, heroes for keeping the flame of this research alive. For more than 30 years, waiting for the moment when the scientific community and the public at large would lift up its head and acknowledge its own blind spots. Acknowledge what it doesn't know and acknowledge what the rest of the brain health and mental health practice has been ignoring for far too long. It took me years to get over my own mental injury. Years of suffering that could have been avoided. And years of suffering that men and women of the world, vets who have served our country, victims of violence, and perhaps even the 10% of you who are out there in the audience now on SSRIs, who could and should be leading fuller, clearer, happier lives, free of blinders and free of blind spots. Together, we can solve the mental health crisis. Together, we can push to bring this science back into the mainstream. Mental health is a human right. And these people, the mentally injured, they deserve to heal too. Thank you.